So I want to talk about first something that was inspired by, I think, someone who's actually a participant here, someone whom I've never met, but I've enjoyed reading, and that is Rachel Sharansky-Danziger. So if you hear, thank you for writing really an essay that inspired us to choose this book for the first session, and also has such wonderful things to say. I think thinking about genre is the best entry for this book, and also for its relationship with Jewish texts, and especially with the book of Jeremiah. Now, as many of you know, there is a very, very long tradition, going back arguably to even the later biblical books, of engaging with the Bible, engaging with biblical texts, intersecting with biblical texts in a variety of ways. Some of these ways we call Midrash, right? That would be a rabbinic form or rabbinic forms of reading the Bible. Some of these forms would be something that scholars refer to as rewritten Bible, where you have texts that might not be considered part of the Hebrew Bible, of the Jewish, biblical canon, and yet are and have been considered sacred by people, and retell biblical stories. And through that retelling, often offer interpretation, new lines of new directions, perhaps filling in issues of plot. So we have things like rewritten Bible, right? We have Midrash. And in fact, there's a variety of ways in which people, Jews in particular, have engaged with biblical texts to draw out meaning, to take it to new places. And when we think about genre of a book like Muck, one way of doing it is by trying to position it somewhere in this wonderful cacophony of engaging biblical texts. Right? Another way of doing it, and I don't want to really pursue this, but I think it should be put out there, is to wonder whether this is a form of historical fiction. I don't think it's a form of historical fiction, even a radical form of historical fiction, but I do want to put it out there because many of the things that we read and often discuss in book salons are historical fiction. And it's worth thinking about to what extent Muck is an attempt, right, even if it's a radical attempt, to reread or retell, I should say, a historical story of a prophet at a moment of crisis and destruction of Jerusalem, and do it in a way that is compelling to readers. I just want to kind of draw your attention to some of the ways in which this is done. Hopefully you got the chance to look at Jeremiah at some point while you were reading this book, while you were reading Muck. I actually spent a few hours today. I've never done this. I've studied the book of Jeremiah at different occasions in my life, but I never sat down and read the entire tragic thing in one sitting. And it is, remarkable, and there were really incredible resonances that I picked up on by just reading the whole thing through. But some of the smaller links could be read as some sort of attempt of Burstein to, imagine, right, and place in a kind of historical narrative the events that take place. If you've studied the book of Jeremiah, you know that there are some sections, some chapters even, which are historical, right? They tell a narrative, they tell a historical narrative, there are people named, and they would not be classified as poetic or even prophetic in that conventional sense. The majority, of course, of the book is prophetic. It's a collection of prophecies. And so, one could argue that what's happening in Muck is a Israeli writer is taking the different pieces of historical narrative, references within the prophecies, and using it and sort of forming it into some kind of historical narrative, which might be thought of as a form of historical fiction. I have a couple of examples right here. You can see on where my cursor is, where he sort of interprets or reinterprets terms. These are not the most obvious, but I think they're some of the most entertaining. One of these would be the torture scene or scenes that Jeremiah undergoes. And if you know the book of Jeremiah, or if you've read Muck, you know that Jeremiah is not a celebrated prophet. We'll talk about that in a second. Could one even be a celebrated prophet if you're a true prophet? Not only is he not celebrated, but he's also abused and even tortured. And using his imagination, Burstein imagines this device that induces extreme dizziness by throwing the body in all sorts of directions, literally ad nauseum. And the person who's the torturer in chief is Pashhor, who is a priest. And if you look at verse 20 of chapter 20, verse 2, we have the description of the torture that Jeremiah undergoes, right? And Pashhor struck Jeremiah and put him in the stocks that were in the upper Benjamin gate, which was in the house of the Lord, right? A verse that you might just pass over quickly when reading it, but actually there are a number of notable features, right? One of them is the fact that these stocks, and all of the translations, biblical translations, are from Robert Alter's wonderful translation. So put him in the stocks, and what about the location, right? It was in the house of the Lord. So these different elements are used or activated by Burstein in his novel. In fact, the torture device that he imagines, where one is thrown around, tossed around, is a kind of interpretation of this word, right? Hamehapechet is the name of the device, and that is really actualized in Burstein's prose. Another small example, there seems to be quite a fad of inscribing the body, of tattooing the body, especially among certain people. And right, Matanya has all of these Akkadian inscriptions. So I'm not sure if Burstein was activating this verse, but it's possible. Judah's offense is written with a pen of iron, inside with an adamantine point, right? So this is just sort of to exemplify the ways in which Burstein is picking up little pieces in the narrative or in the prophet. The first example is from the narrative. The second part is from a prophecy, and using it to spin a tale, right? A narrative. I think a more productive way of thinking about what's happening, and this is hopefully will guide us, is something that actually comes up in Rachel Sharansky-Danziger's review. And I'm just going to move. I can see some of your faces, which is wonderful, but I can't see the full screen. So I'm just going to read this bolded part. He prefers reading texts like Targum Jonathan, right? Targum Yonatan, an old translation of the Bible into Aramaic. For example, where each sentence is measured against the original in two fashions: its fidelity to the original on the one hand, and its distance from it on the other, right? All this engages the reader in a much more complex way, which is more exciting and pleasurable than most books on sale, however interesting they are. In fact, this is a wholly different perception of the nature of literature. So I think this is a fascinating little quote. And in fact, it allows us to think about many different ways in which books, works, intersect with the Bible, and a book like this book intersects with the Bible. We shouldn't necessarily think of it as historical fiction. In fact, I don't think we should. We shouldn't think of it really as Midrash or rewritten Bible. Perhaps we should think about it in terms of translation, right? Where you constantly think about the relationship of, right, one text and its other text in a kind of stereo, right? Almost like a stereoscope that you see with two eyes. So let me stop here for a minute. I'm gonna stop sharing the screen. And I wanted to see if there are reactions about that, or if some people want to already open up and speak about the book before we go on to the next section. If not, oh.
I didn't follow what the best way to suggest that I have a comment was.
Well, I was able to see your hand, so that's great.
And you chose not to call on me. All jokes. But I love what you're saying about the genre point and this kind of like double refractory mirror of the translation. And I was thinking also that in a certain sense it reads kind of like an almost like apocrypha, or like apocalyptic literature, like a Tu Baruch or a For Ezra, or like a Testament of Abraham kind of vibe, which in these texts, they kind of also have this double mirror aspect of part of what's fun for them, at least as like a religious Jew, is there's similarity both to Chazal sometimes, as well as to Tanakh, as well as what's fun about them is kind of this literary life that they have that's so distant and separate. And like all these fun stories that occur that are very much not in the that don't appear in Chazal, don't appear in Tanakh, and especially with For Baruch and the Testament of Avram, Testament of Isaac and Jacob. For me, they kind of have this also like kind of similar Jobian vibe. So I didn't think about that while reading. So thanks for sharing that genre question.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And just to follow up, yes, I mean, within the genre, the broader genre that some refer to as rewritten Bible, I think your point is very well taken, that we're specifically looking at a subset or a kind of rewritten text, biblical text, and that is apocalyptic, right? We'll get to apocalyptic literature, hopefully, in a little bit, but thank you for that comment. And I think Beth was raising.
I'm going to take the prerogative here. Sorry. If everyone, it would be so nice just introduce yourself for a second, your name and where you are physically sitting or whatever, where you're from, just so that we can get a sense. Sorry for jumping in, but I think that would be nice. So Yehuda, you know what? Why don't you we have each other's names, right? Where are you at?
Sure thing. My name is Yehuda, and I'm from Woodmere, New York.
We are Toba and Bob Goldberg from Brooklyn.
Amazing. Yeah, I mean, I meant like as we speak, so we don't lose the flow. So we can, as you make a comment, perhaps start with that, and then we'll get everybody's voices in. So I think that you may have been up next, and then I'll give it back to Shai. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm Beth Kislev. I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I know that Dror Burstein has written 14 books. The only ones that I've read are the translated ones, Kin and Netanya. And I know one of the things he's really interested in, particularly in Netanya, is this blend of genres. It's sort of an essay, a scientific treatise, work of imagination. It's a lot of things. And I'm just wondering if this is sui generis, in terms of his work. That does he deal with Bible and other works of his? I'm sort of wondering how this fits into his oeuvre, since he's written so much else as well.
So there may be people who have read more Dror than I have. The things that I have read, I always find are engaged in one way or another with Jewish texts, biblical, rabbinic, even Kabbalistic. That could be because most of the reading that I did of Burstein was in Hebrew. And the things I read were not nearly as explicitly engaged. I mean, really just telling biblical story as our book. But he could be positioned in terms of contemporary Israeli writers on the part of the spectrum that is actually very committed to doing things with classical Jewish texts, right? And that is a divide in Israeli writing today. I would definitely position him as someone who's almost always doing something, even if it's not explicit with Jewish texts. But maybe other people have read more Burstein and might have comments on that. I see Miriam's hand is up. Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
Yes, I have to unmute myself. That's why I was looking, and my cursor wasn't where I thought it was. I'm Miriam Isero. I'm in Silver Spring, Maryland. And I have to say, I really did not enjoy this book. And I sort of feel when I saw that Rachel had written about his being averse to reading novels, I felt like, boy, I never want to read a book by another novelist who's averse to novels. So I'm, so I found that your remarks about this, trying to identify the genre, maybe it'll be more interesting as we go along to explicate what this is. But I just felt like it was a game. And, there are like lots of tricks there, but I didn't think it was worth 406 pages to play that game. I got it really quickly. And so I'm hoping that as we go along, I'll figure out, that together we'll get insights on why this game that he played was worth it. Because I just felt like it was someone showing off his brilliance and his knowledge of biblical language, which I think isn't really such a big deal if you've studied biblical text. But I'm hoping we'll be enlightened.
Great. So is it Rachel or Rachel? Oh, yeah, I think you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, Rachel, hi.
Okay.
I'm
Hi.
Rachel, I'm in Boston. Nice to meet you all. This is really fun. First of all, Miriam, I just wanted to say that I loved it, but I definitely hear what you're saying. And I definitely at some point felt that he's just kind of getting carried away with his ability to create it. And it's like, okay, but what are we actually making a point here? So I hear you, even if my experience is different. I just wanted to say about this kind of translation, where the translation is not from language to language, it's really from the ancient experience or the biblical text to our experience today. I think that sometimes the role of this kind of translation is to shock us into familiarity. And, we're all awash with Hamilton, the musical commentary right now. So I kind of think of it like that in the musical, Lin-Manuel Miranda told a well-known and venerated or the opposite story, depending what your beliefs are, but in a musical language that feels so familiar and so juxtaposed, so it's counterpoint to the content that it forces us to look at the founders as real people. And when you look at the characters from Yirmiyahu, the prophet, that we can just don't care about and don't feel like they're reflecting us in any way. And all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, they're engaging in things that are infinitely familiar. It's maybe that's the saving grace of the more kind of virtuosic and yet what's the point parts of the book for me. It's bringing the potential of Jeremiah into fulfillment in a modern context as a tochecha, really.
Yeah. Thanks. I just wanted to add something to what you were saying and maybe sharpen a point I was trying to make earlier, especially, with that way of thinking about the book in terms of Targum. One of the differences between a Targum as a form of writing, or not just writing, as we'll see in a second, and things like Midrash, is that Targum has a performative and really does have a stereo feature to it, right? Some of you actually might have heard Targum recited. There are still some Jewish communities, for example, Yemenite communities, that do recite Targum. And the way the translation is recited is the text of the Torah is read, and then the Targum is also read. And there's a kind of interesting auditory experience in which you have the original ancient text, and at least when the Targumim were first formulated, you have a more vernacular, version. Now it obviously takes on a different connotation because, for the most part, we don't really have Aramaic speakers doing this. But nevertheless, the way in which the ancient and the vernacular coincide through Targum is really interesting, and I think is part of what's happening in Burstein's work here, right? You know, you have Nebuchadnezzar, you have these characters with the same names. The enemies, right? The warring enemies are not Iraq, right? But Bavel, right? Egypt, right, as Mitzrayim in its ancient context. And yet, right, the scene is hyper contemporary, down to a bookstore which actually isn't even that old, you know, Adar Abba Books in Rehavia, or other place, the Light Rail, which is, you know, really recent
Talat
memory.
Sfarim. Don't forget Talat Sfarim, which is in Tel
Yes,
Aviv,
so
not
that's
Jerusalem.
yes, correct. Yeah, I mean, for those who live or know, who lived or know Israel very well, you know, there's some really nice touches there. But the point I'm making is there's something, I think, maybe difficult in what he's doing. Perhaps it's also show-offy, but I think something compelling in the way he's sort of bringing these two layers together at once in one very long, perhaps bombastic piece of writing. Maybe we'll get, you know, Elisheva, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the time the desirable impulse to frame contemporary Jewish literature or historical experiences in Jewish terms overemphasizes their Jewiness, and then when there's some, I mean, I think in a lot of ways this is a fic, and in some ways the novel that it's structurally or on a genre level most like that I was thinking about is Donald Barthelme's The King, right? Where he puts modern characters and modern speech and modern conventions and the you know, National Union of Miners strike into the King Arthur novels, and has those people eating Ryvita crackers and welding locomotives to the railroad tracks as they argue about whether might makes right. And it's on Mallory, and it's on T.H. White, and it's on the state of Britain, you know, in modern times. And I feel like in a lot of ways he's doing the same thing, but I gotta say he's doing it at 4 times the length. And I'm both, I admired it a lot, and I feel it, but I think that there's a in Israeli fiction now, there's this deep engagement with this luxurious, virtuosic language play. In a lot of ways, you see it also, I think, in Ruby Nander's novel. It's in A Beit Shanakrav, where he's taking these classical pieces and he's just unpacking them at extreme virtuosic aesthetic length. And it's hard for me to see it. Like, Yirmiyahu there's a lot of economy. You sat down an afternoon and reread all of Yirmiyahu. And there's so much going on there. And I think it would be hard to do that with this book. And I think it's a fair question to say, what are the goals? It's not just Targum. It's Targum, and it's aestheticization, and it's a sense of playing in the international feeling that you're entitled to take it over and make something 3 times as big because you're of the aesthetic experience. I'm just really thinking a lot at the end of the day about what happens if we boil Yirmiyahu down to the aesthetic. Are we still pleased with that?
Yeah. I mean, you know, one of the things I experienced in reading Yirmiyahu in one sitting, essentially, I broke for coffee, was I don't know if I would use economy to describe what's happening in the book. I mean, maybe in individual prophecies, he isn't really luxuriating, even like other Hebrew prophets, you know, might. But if you look at the compilation, right, and we don't have time to really talk about the compilation of the book of Jeremiah. There are, you know, repetitions, quote unquote. There are echoes. I think these are aesthetically fascinating and compelling, but it is not, and it is, as a compilation, I wouldn't describe it as entirely economical. And I think, you know, first of all, I don't know whether Jeremiah was ever meant to be read in one sitting. I don't think it was. I'm not sure. I'm not a biblical scholar. But it certainly is not a novel, right? The book of Jeremiah. Now we read, you know, we take this book and we say, okay, you know, it says that it's a novel. So it's a novel, but maybe Burstein also isn't really writing a novel. I mean, that could get us into other questions about genre. So I think we should pause here and move on to kind of a further discussion. But this was really fascinating. I always feel, and you know, at other Beit Midrash and book salons that I've done, I always feel that the conversation only really gets going, the blood only gets flowing when people are critical about the book. So I'm so glad that I've already heard some really great criticisms of the book to get us moving along. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen again, and I want to kind of move on to the next section, or even two, if that's okay. Here we go. Okay, so we spoke already a little about what might be described as the anachronism, but that would only be what you would say if you were expecting a historical novel. It is anachronistic to imagine the coming together of, you know, the light rail being used to deport Judean, you know, exiles. But one of the things that I think is happening with anachronism, with Burstein's work, but also with Jeremiah, the character in the book's work, is a remarkable fleet of imagination. And what I want to kind of argue, at least put out there, is that imagination, and even poetic imagination, is perhaps one of the key aspects of what it means to be a prophet. Right? One needs to be able to see things that are not there, especially if you're prophesying destruction of a city that, you know, is bustling. You know, and this is actually a theme that recurs in prophetic literature, including in the book of Jeremiah. I wanted to just point out one verse which I think nicely perhaps encapsulates this idea with actually the word that at least some interpret as imagination. So this is Jeremiah chapter 6, verses 2 to 3. Lovely and delicate did I, and then the word is damiti, right? I imagine, and that is in fact how Robert Alter translates the verse. Zion's daughter, against her came shepherds with their flocks, they pitched their tents all around, each shepherded his charge, right? Now, there are other ways of interpreting this verse. I cited Rashi, for example, the great medieval commentator, who makes an argument, actually, I didn't cite the entire commentary, but makes an argument that one could interpret this as destroy. But I think imagine does some really interesting work in this verse, both in, you know, verse number 2, but also verse, you know, flowing into verse number 3, right? In fact, maybe Zion's daughter is not so lovely and delicate anymore in this moment in history. And moreover, moving into the next verse, in order to imagine the impending doom that Jeremiah invokes over and over again in his prophecies, right? One needs to fire up this faculty, right? One needs to see things, imagine things that are not there. You need to imagine, you know, the tents that are pitched all around, right? These armies that are invading. You need to imagine, as the novel does, you know, this light rail transporting, you know, exiles into Babylon. You need to imagine, even though they're not there yet, the black helicopters, the Mercedes that are coming in and intruding upon the city. So, you know, this might be kind of an obvious point, but it is an important point for sort of conceiving of what's happening when we're thinking about prophecy and the work that Jeremiah is doing, both in the biblical book, but also in Muck. And just to kind of continue that, I want to also maybe discuss, I think, one of the most playful aspects of the characterization of Jeremiah and Jeremiah's world, and that is the world of poets, right? These Jerusalem poets who admittedly don't really have large audiences. They certainly have a lot of self-importance, but they don't have, they don't have crowds coming to see them. Sometimes they read to an almost empty room. And there's a whole economy, right, of how these poets to this day work, and who gets to say who's a good poet and who's a bad poet, right? So, I want to sort of bring that into the discussion and hear what people have to say about that characterization. And then we can start talking about sort of the problem of the poets. Why is it that in this novel, and in fact in other cultural contexts, really insignificant people, these poets who are just saying words or scribbling them in the sides of newspapers, are seen as such a threat to the regime, right? This is somewhat quoted out of context, but a very important classical text, a dialogue, or actually a number of dialogues in Plato's The Republic, sees poets and poetry as so deeply problematic and dangerous that they should be removed from the kingdom, right? And certainly from the truth. And that, in fact, is kind of what happens, or what is attempted in this book. So I want to think about prophecy not only as an act of imagination, to be able to see that impending destruction, but also as this, more prosaic economy of poets and critics who, on the one hand, seem not very significant, and on the other hand, are taken very, very seriously. So maybe we'll stop also again for, to talk and discuss. Those who want to chime in can kind of raise their hand, or we could also move on. Or if you don't have your camera on, I think you could chat as well. Okay, so Rachel, sorry.
I don't know about Yirmiyahu per se, but in the context of the novel and also in our day and age in general, I think that Plato's words definitely resonate with me because, and I'm saying that as a blogger, as someone who deals with writing criticism and publishing it, I'm very aware of the fact that rhetoric is effective. It makes people agree with you, but it does not mean that you have a justified source of authority to make the arguments you're making. And if you're using language and beautiful language to create such an indelible impression that moves people to action, the onus is on you to prove it to be an upright person. That is not if you just want to achieve your goals, but if you want to aspire to some ethics of poetry, if you want to talk about the ethics of poetry, the ethics of social criticism, whatever it is, of blogging, the onus is on you to have something beyond just the beauty of your words to compel, to coerce people into agreement. And in the book of Yirmiyahu, there's a problem of the false prophets. I see that you're going to get to it, so I'm not going to go into it, but that's always a problem. How do you know if something is not just beautiful, it's always true?
That's great, thank you. Yeah. So should we go on? Yes, I think we will go on to talking about the problems of, the true prophets and the false prophets. Of course, this is a major theme of the book of Jeremiah. There are quote unquote false prophets and quote unquote true prophets. And the true prophet, right, Jeremiah, is arguing that if we're just thinking in political terms, that, you can't rely on Egypt. Babylonia is coming, and basically you need to prepare yourself for this reality, one in which you will go into exile in Babylonia, and that sort of coming political wave has to be ridden. The false prophets argue that, in fact, the Babylonians will be defeated, or the vessels will be returned, different ways of referring to the ineffectiveness of the Babylonian prophets. And Egypt, in fact, the Pharaoh, who has been, who the Judeans have had a relationship with that regime, will come to the rescue, and there won't be what to worry about. Right, so that's just kind of reminding you of a very overly simplistic way of sort of thinking about who is in the book of Jeremiah, in the biblical book, who is the true prophet, and what kind of political argument is being made, and then the false prophet. But I want to sort of take a step back, and I'm going to share the screen again. Oh no. Is it here? Okay, hold on. I just have to make sure that here we go. I don't know why it went lower. The problem of the true and the false prophet is sort of dealt with head on in a very sort of influential text in the book of Deuteronomy. And the impression that one gets from this text is that there is a way of knowing who is a true prophet and who is a false prophet. And that, simply has to do with truth, right? And false. And I'll read the verse and you'll see what I mean, right? A prophet, the Lord, God is speaking. A prophet I shall raise up from them, from the midst of their brothers like you, and I shall put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I charge him. And it shall be the man who does not heed my words, which he will speak in my name, I myself will requite it of him. But the prophet who willfully speaks a word in my name, which I have not charged him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. So the stakes are very high, right? If this is, a prophet, then one needs to listen because that is the word of God. But if it is not, then that person is prophesying not in the name of God and shall die. And should you say in your heart the obvious question, how should we know that shall we know the word that the Lord has not spoken? That which the prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, and the thing does not happen, it does not come about, this is the word that the Lord did not speak. Willfully did the prophet speak it, you shall have no dread of him. So without getting into the details of that text, but reminding you that it does become a kind of very influential text, even post-biblically. It's a famous passage in Maimonides that is very much inspired by this text. It's a sort of simple test. If the predictions, right, which are made come true, then you know that this is a true prophet. If the predictions do not come true, then it's a false prophet. That doesn't seem to be what's happening in Jeremiah. There seems to be another criteria, and thinking also of our novel, of Muck, there seems to be something else going on in terms of what makes someone a true prophet, or in the terms of the novel, what makes someone a true, I like that phrase that Rachel used, an ethical poet, right? It's not that you have predictive powers always, but I think something else. I want to just look quickly at a few sections to bring this idea to fruition. So if we look at B over here, and I said, alas, O Master Lord, look, the prophets say to them, you shall not see the sword, nor famine shall you have, but true well-being will I give you in this place? And the Lord said to me, lies do the prophets prophesy my name. I did not send them, nor did I charge them, nor did I speak to them. A vision of lies and a groundless divination and their own heart's deceits do they prophesy to you. Right, so here we have the term set out, right? The prophets, the false prophets are saying, you shall not see the sword, there won't be famine, everything's going to be hunky-dory. And God says that in fact, that's not true. I did not send the prophet. In another section, in chapter 28, we get a bit more detail of the kinds of arguments, not only that these prophets were making, but the clashes that they had with Jeremiah, right, the true prophet. This is one of the scenes that was retold, I think very successfully, when there is this international meeting of nations in the novel that's made in order to figure out how to go back to the Egyptians and drop the Babylonians. That, by the way, I remind you, and we'll talk about this figure in a second, Broch, is where we find out that the critic of the poets, the critic of the true poet even, but not only, of Jeremiah, is in fact a dangerous false prophet named Hananiah, who is making this argument, right? So I don't want to take too much time. Let's look at the end. The prophet who prophesies peace. When the word of the prophet comes about, it will be known of the prophet that the Lord truly sent him. Now you can read that verse basically. It's not that a true prophet cannot, it's not that a true prophet always prophesies doom. But there is a way of reading this verse, I think, where for the most part, real prophets are prophesying things that people don't want to hear. They're prophesying doom, right? That's why they're receiving the prophecy. They're given a message, right, to convey to the authorities that there is a problem. So if you have a prophet who prophesies peace, right, well, then only when the word of the prophet comes about do you know that that prophet really truly sent him. But until then, you should be suspicious of a prophet who's telling you that everything's going to be okay. So in other words, an argument could be made, and I think it is being made in the novel, that a true prophet says things that make the regime and the people uncomfortable, right? A true prophet is a sort of doomsday figure. And a false prophet is the person who tells you that everything you're doing is just fine. You're living your life perfectly, and there's no problem here. You have nothing to worry about. So I know I'm sort of wading into a controversial area in terms of not only theologically determining who a false and true prophet is, but also within the book of Jeremiah. But I do think an argument can be made, and I believe Burstein is making this, that the true prophet or the true poet is the one who says negative, upsetting things. So I want to, before kind of hearing what you all have to say, I just want to list a few characters that we could think of and wonder to what extent they are true prophets in the novel, right? Jeremiah, he is a true prophet. He is the true prophet of the book of Jeremiah. And then we have other mysterious, troubling figures, such as this woman who keeps on lodging complaints of rape. The story changes, and it seems somehow not only about her own personal tragedy, but somehow it's nationalized, right? It seems to me that she's also a true prophet. She's saying things that make people very, very uncomfortable. Nobody wants to hear about an assault. Everyone wants to think that their society is upstanding. And when someone comes, particularly a vulnerable woman comes, right, and makes a claim, files a report or tries to file a report at the police department, as occurs in the novel, it makes people very nervous. They'll either nervously laugh, right? They'll dismiss her. So I think that's another kind of interesting example in the novel. And one could argue, more broadly as an example of a sort of true prophet. Jeremiah's mother also we might think of as a prophet. This is kind of interesting because the father doesn't really have much of a prophetic role in the novel, but the mother also makes people very uncomfortable, right? Particularly about her vegetarianism. She comes into restaurants and reminds people of what exactly it is that they're eating. Now, not only is that, does that make her a true prophet in the sense that she's saying things that make people uncomfortable, but I think it also reflects the kind of activation of imagination. Not to see things that aren't there, but actually to really see things that people don't normally see. I say this not as personally vegetarian, though I'm the father of one of my kids as a vegetarian, but there is something about the process by which you remember, right, as you're eating, as these characters are in the novel, a piece of meat, and you really sort of imagine or remember, right, that this was a living creature. Often this disgusts people. If my kids mention this at the table, then everyone else will stop eating chicken, right? But Jeremiah's mother is not just saying uncomfortable things, but she's making people see things, right, that they normally can't see, right? So I would argue that that's another prophet. Netanya, who becomes Tzidkiyahu, this is kind of a question. Is he a fallen prophet? Does he start his life as someone who maybe really could be a true prophet and then just disintegrates in something else? And then I want to put Broch out there. Broch, we're introduced to in the first section of the novel as that, critic, that literary critic. When I first read those first pages of the novel, I didn't necessarily think he was a true prophet, but I thought he was Baruch. And this is especially the case in the Hebrew, although it's vocalized to say Baruch. These are the same letters as Baruch. And as we know from the book of Jeremiah and later in the novel, Baruch is Jeremiah's scribe, right? So there's a way in which this character, I think, signifies for us how the question of who is who and what is what, who is a true prophet, who is a false prophet, who is that character that you're expecting, right? Oh, it's Baruch, but it's so weird, he's a critic, and how does that work? In fact, is shown to be not the case at all. So let me stop sharing the screen and get a few reactions and hear, what people made of things. I see there are also some comments. Could the people who wrote in the comments also speak them? I think it's easier that way, if that's okay. So I think Rachel had a comment and Elisheva, though those could have been said earlier, but otherwise people could, yeah. People want to talk about things they want to say earlier or comment on some of these things now. Okay, yeah, Yehuda. Just remember to unmute yourself.
Yes. Yeah, I'm struck by this read that you have now about the prophet as disturber, or as both as disturbed and disturber, I guess, the prophet. And it reminds me of a line by Louis L. about, maybe you mentioned it before and I just missed it, about how, I think he just says, he has a nice line somewhere that the line between a true prophet and a false prophet is that the former disturbs and the latter comforts, or something like that, which is like an easy binary. And it even strikes me what you're saying about the prophet / poet as critic, with like that striking scene early in the book when Brock smashes the keyboard with Jeremiah's head, which is like smacking him with like his underappreciation for the word and for letters and for the truth. To me, is kind of like, it's so disturbing as a reader when you read it. It's like when kind of the absurdist under edginess of the book kind of starts coming out to you a little bit, when they just go for it and he's smashing a keyboard on his head and it's ridiculous. But that is kind of like when some of these points started coming out for me in like a foreboding way.
Yeah. You knew that you were not going to have an easy read in many senses for that first section.
Yeah.
I think Beth has a comment. Beth, just jump in. I don't know if you see your hand.
Okay. When you quoted the source from Dvorim chapter 18, I was reminded of chapter 17 earlier, where the king has to write a copy of the Torah for himself. And the sort of distinction, prophecy is always oral, yet there's this whole play, to sort of follow up on what Yehuda was saying, of things being written down, and Baruch as Baruch the scribe, and kind of where there's what the question of orality and things that are written, and I guess the role of that in prophecy, that when things are written down, there's some kind of change when something is no longer oral, when it's transmitted in writing rather than oral, because having the law written down for the king in Deuteronomy 17 means that everybody knows what the law is and it can be read and we're all aware of it, whereas a prophet is just saying some message that's oral, and mistakes can be made in a different kind of way when things are oral as opposed to when they're written. So I just sort of wanted to.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, in the book of Jeremiah, one of the most dramatic scenes is when his prophecies are written and then destroyed and then written again, right? Which in the novel is, it's sort of captured in different ways, but, the same sense, I think, as you described as, what happens when you write down a prophecy, something fundamentally different happens. I mean, he'd been saying all these things, and now Jeremiah is writing it down. So in the novel, his first arrest is when he just scribbles those things in the newspaper. Right. It's one thing when it's a reading in Smol Shel Shom, right? But it's another thing, even if it's on a newspaper on a restaurant, dirty restaurant table, when it's written down, it's threatening in a way that it wasn't previously. So yeah, I mean, the question of what it means to write and what role writing plays is really central in Jeremiah and also in this novel.
Yeah. I was thinking about the idea that your scribe who takes dictation for you and writes things down for you is Baruch, but that the critic who reads what you've written down and makes sense out of it is a brach, which it's the transformation of the word of a bracha into this sort of Yiddishism to mean a curse or a mess or a disaster area. That the difference between the scribe and the critic is just the different face or different pointing of this two-faced word. He's just a mess. I mean,
but he's also, I think I heard, and I agree with you, sort of positive appraisal of critics. They bring out the meaning, but this guy, he's the opposite of a scribe. I mean, there are scenes where he sees the poems are just marked out. So the real Baruch, which I wish we would have time to talk about, that fascinating character at the end of the book, who is the same as this Nubian, this Kushi character. He's productive. He writes. He makes things last, and he's worried about Jeremiah's legacy, quite like the biblical Baruch. Yeah. And the Broch is just the opposite. Just scratching out. And I would imagine that comes from, very much comes from Burstein's world as a writer, where you still fear these critics, who can either make your career, go up or go down. So.
Yeah, I was also going to say that with the prophecy, the way prophecy comes to you, that with, in the book with Yirmiyahu, he is, he can't help himself. He wants to, at times he even wants to help himself. He doesn't want it to come out of him, but he can't restrain it. He has to say these things. And I thought what's interesting is how Matanya leaves his poetry behind him when he becomes Tzidkiyahu. Here he was such a poet. He was, the star of the Jerusalem poets. And then once he becomes king, he's, he sort of occasionally sort of will say something as if he's, like he'll sort of, he's never a poet, but he'll sort of say, oh yes, I, because I was an artist, I have to do this thing, but the muse is gone.
Yes.
So the
Yeah.
prophecy is gone.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Any other comments before maybe moving on? Yeah, Rachel.
I just want to point out something curious, that I think that one of the brilliant ways that Burstein designs or kind of fashions the contrast between Yirmiyahu and Tzidkiyahu has to do with writing. That we start by meeting Yirmiyahu as a man that the letters on his keyboards are erased. He's a man whose writing is erased. It's not permanent. It's not, the king who dies in the Chumus Ball writes some of what Yirmiyahu says and then mistakenly reads it, but then it presumably drowns with the king. It's not, the things don't have things don't have physical substance, but they survive in spirit. Their truth comes out. Whereas Matanya has all these tattooed letters that are unremovable, they're permanent, and maybe his flesh, his kingly royal flesh, his blood ties him to things, and he seems more free on the outside. He can be a poet or a king. He can choose. He can embrace this or that identity. But at the end of the day, he dies with Jerusalem. The truth dies with the flesh. It doesn't outlive it, in a sense.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's another thing that as part of this discussion, we should all be considering. It's not merely, the oral versus the written, but it's also the medium on which things are written down, whether it's the scroll or it's the skin in the novel. Those tattoos are really sort of fascinating. I mean, I suggested perhaps, that Burstein is kind of reading this verse about the sins being inscribed, but it goes much beyond that. And, the illegibility for most, because it's an archaic Akkadian, and, the question of identity in writing is also really central when it comes to tattoos and inscribing. So thank you. Maybe we'll yeah, I'm sorry, someone.
Go ahead. I would just like to ask why the book is entitled Muck. That was something I didn't understand.
So it's a great question, because while muck comes up in different forms in the novel, it doesn't necessarily seem to be the most central motif. In the biblical book and in the novel, of course, Jeremiah is placed into this terrible pit with muck. And also, in a kind of carnivalesque ending in the novel, at this bombastic Guinness Book of World Records biggest hummus bowl, the king dies. But I actually will get to why I think muck is a really important thing in Jeremiah's career, and hopefully I'll be able to answer that in the next few minutes. So let's take a quick look back at the screen. Try to find, there we go. I wanted to, there's so many things I'd like to talk about, and I don't know if we'll have time to talk about this, but I did want to just put one thing out there. When you try to do the kind of work that Burstein is doing, and others, even people who write like Yochi Brandis, or other contemporary Israeli and not Israeli novelists who try to do things with the Bible, there often is a problem of really translating what it is that is motivating the characters in the biblical story, or what it is that exercises the prophets. And idolatry is one of those things. I mean, there's a very, very old tradition of trying to really easily explain what the Bible's obsession with idolatry is all about, right? So it's, verses like, do not make Elohei Chesef, do not make silver idols, are read as do not, be a capitalist, right? Or do not worship money, or whatever sort of ethical principle one thinks that you can pull out of the biblical obsession with idolatry. I think it's really interesting what Burstein does with the idols that are so ubiquitous in the book of Jeremiah and thus have to be reckoned with in his book. He doesn't turn it into just, these are people who worship, silver and gold and money. He makes it into, I think, a kind of believable hip, emphasis on hip or even hipster cult, right? Where people have their little fetishes and it's just part of their identity, their striving in life. And yet, and I don't know if we'll have time to really pursue this, but there's something deeply problematic about this kind of cool use of these fetishes. So I'll just read this passage, which struck me. This is about Noah and the person who becomes, right, Sidkiyahu. She didn't dump him, however, but came to him at once in a taxi and sat facing him and told him that she understood perfectly that she too, during her time in Moab, sought out the same sort of connection, and idol worshiping had been nothing less than the desire to touch the sacred, and not only verbally. She told him, make use of him. When he didn't understand, she said, it's a quote. He still didn't get it, and then she explained it to him. She had a silver statue of Balpur in her motley shoulder bag. While in the closet where he stored his building contraptions, Matanya kept a pair of life-size statues of the god Ashur and his consort, Ishtar. And these become, both sexual fetishes and ways in which people, in this case, particularly young people, made meaning in the world. So I just want to put it out there. And I want to go to the final part. And if we have time, we could discuss that as well. I want to draw your attention to perhaps the most famous depiction of Jeremiah, and it's one of Rembrandt's most famous paintings, because, of course, it is one of the greatest paintings that was ever made. But I don't think that is the type of Jeremiah that Burstein is depicting. And it also arguably is not the figure of Jeremiah in the Bible itself. Right, so famously, I should have put the full title here, and because it's 3:12 in the morning, I can't remember the full title, but it is depicting Jeremiah at the once the destruction has taken place. So all of the tension and buildup in the earlier part of the book, where he's yelling and screaming and prophesying that all this is going to happen, it's happened. And there he sits. He's there are many ways of describing what's on his face. There's a sense of not only disappointment, but that tragic sense that he tried and he couldn't, and things are what they are. There's something else that's, I think, happening with Jeremiah that is really, really painful to think about, but is so present in the novel and in the Bible, and frankly is something that's worth thinking about during this time in the Jewish calendar. I put on the top of the handout that it is the 17th of Tammuz. It is tonight. So, in the Jewish tradition of beginning the day at the night, it is now, I think even for you, the 17th of Tammuz, which of course is the beginning of a period of annual mourning that commemorated a siege of Jerusalem, which ended and ends and is commemorated on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. It's a dark period. It's a period where we don't really seek out comfort. And of course, what I said about prophets only being doomsday prophets is not true in the Jewish tradition. There are prophets of consolation, and even Jeremiah is seen as sort of torn between these two roles. But there is certainly space during this time of year to contemplate the darkest things. And that's what's happening in this section. And then I'll just draw your attention to some verses from Jeremiah. And this actually has to do with the muck, right? Jeremiah could have, just if we think even of the biblical Jeremiah or this character, he could have had a little internal "I told you so." He was always doubted, right? He was always told that his prophecies were wrong. And they turned out to be right. Babylon exiled the Judeans. It destroyed the city. And the tragedy that he had prophesied came true. But in this passage, that's not the sentiment that one gets. There's a really nihilistic and Job-like sentiment that's quite present. And this is when he was placed into the pit filled with muck. And he's certainly going to die, though, as we know. He's rescued at the last minute in a very dramatic scene that's both depicted in the book of Jeremiah with these men, lifting him from the muck, and also in the novel. It was perfectly quiet there, as in a cave, but without any echo. And Jeremiah knew now that he was undefeated, that none of this was important. The pit wasn't important. The muck wasn't important. He'd never been defeated, even though he'd been battered and bruised. He'd stood up to his trials. What exactly the point was of his having suffered through them all, he couldn't quite say. But then nobody was demanding an answer from him either. By now it was very hot in the city. Summer was here. But in the pit it was cool. Jeremiah already knew that the Babylonians would soon batter down the city walls and set Jerusalem to the torch, and that the flames would consume the court of the guards and the palace and the temple and the desiccated fruit trees in their enclosures, whose shadows his eyes had registered a short while before on the way over from the temple. But none of this concerned him, not at all, for he was deep in the pit, in this pit that would protect him and shield him the way a shell shields its pearl in the depths of the sea, even as a whale glides overhead. Even when Jeremiah died, the shell would still watch over him, for he knew that he would soon die there, floundering, that the pit would be both his executioner and his grave, and that the foul-smelling muck in which he would drown would harden over him after the destruction of the city in the heat of this dry summer, after all the city's sewage stopped oozing through the pipes, the way the piss and shit in a corpse likewise dry up and cease to flow. Though the city and its ramparts swam above his head, he was no longer in the world, but under the world. The pit nourished Jeremiah deep in its bosom, and he called his sister to mind. She too had had a pit, her illness, and she too had been slowly sucked into the muck. And his parents too, for that matter, had sunk in their Babylonian pit, he reflected. Why, the world's nothing more than an ocean of muck. Okay, the end. And he shut his eyes and relaxed, just as someone who's been clinging to the edge of a cliff might finally slacken his grip. So it's a moment of sort of utter nihilism and despair. It's not, strangely, it's not a weeping, tragic despair, but it's just a realization that it's all meaningless, it's all worthless. Who cares? The Babylonians come, I've been saying it, no one listens. It doesn't really matter. And, now I can seek my peace. I just wanted to, end with point out two things in the book of Jeremiah itself. One is there are actually a number of places where we see a close connection between the book of Jeremiah and the book of Job. It seems that the author of Job had access to and used and reworked sections of Jeremiah. And this is a very Job-like section, though, of course, that's anachronistic, right? Curse the day that I was born, the day my mother bore me, let it not be blessed. Curse the man who brought tidings to my father, saying, a male child is born to you, giving him great joy, etc., etc. Why from the womb did I come to see wretchedness and sorrow, and my days end in shame, right? This is much more than, a sentence thrown here or there by Elijah or by Jonah, I wish I was dead. This is a profoundly negative view of Jeremiah's fate in the world. So I wanted to end, I won't end at a negative part, and I want to hear more of what people have to say, but I wanted to show how, how this affected, both in the biblical book and also the novel, the personality of Jeremiah. Right? One could imagine that a prophet, if, as we've argued, is really speaking truth to power, he is a poet, right? He has imagination, that even if people beat him and hurt him, he would have pride, right? It would be a great career. And in fact, we find with Jeremiah that he lives in the novel and in the book a pretty miserable life. He never marries. And in fact, I noticed today in my read that God tells him, I somehow didn't remember this, do not marry a wife, do not bear children because of this impending destruction in prophecy in chapter 18. And, it seems that the prophecies of destruction that he conveys, the smashing and the uprooting, are also about himself, right? See, I've appointed you this day over nations, owner for kingdoms, to uproot and to smash and to destroy and to lay waste, right? So that laying waste, that destruction isn't just for these nations. In a way, he is shattered. This whole process of being a prophet, he complains about it. It ruins him. It doesn't just ruin the people who have to bear the news. But of course, they're the last two words of this verse, right? To build and to plant. And as much as Jeremiah, even, famously in the English language, Jeremiah is mainly remembered as a doomsday prophet, there are prophecies in the book that are considered in the language of Jewish tradition, prophecies of consolation. He's seen as sort of torn between these two poles, and there are even verses where he seems to, start out with consolation and a negative note, or here in the opposite direction. Jeremiah ultimately does prophesy about building and planting. He tells the Judean exiles to build, to purchase land, to create families, also in the exile. And in that way, sort of slipped into this verse, and I think even slipped into this incredibly bleak novel. There is a sense that although the prophecies come true, although the prophecies, prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem and the shattering of Jeremiah, somehow, right, life does go on, right? It might go on elsewhere, but it goes on. And, it's something to ponder even during these very dark times cosmically and also in the moment that we're living in. So I'd love to hear comments. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everybody's face again, and kind of open floor, anything people, impressions people had of the novel or further thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. Yeah.
I'll cut in. First of all, just thank you so much, Shai. This was really a lot of fun, really interesting. Your description of the grim satisfaction of the poet prophet whose prophecies come to pass reminds me of Uri Tzvi Greenberg, right? Who in the 20s and the 30s had these visions of the Jews of Europe being gassed to death. And he felt and he lived in Jerusalem, and he felt that no one would hear him and no one heard him, and it all came to pass. And there's descriptions of him, wandering Tel Aviv. He wrote in his next collection of poetry, about the experience of what it's like, and using very much like the passage that you just quoted, this feeling of being underwater, sort of covered by the ocean as he sees these ghostly apparitions all around him, his prophecies having come to pass. I wondered if there wasn't a kind of an illusion there. That's just more of a kind of a comment, and especially, guys, the way that the poet, at least used to in Israel, play the role really of the prophet. But I guess the second question I have is just, leaving aside the aesthetics, what does it mean for a contemporary Israeli writer to kind of foresee the destruction of Jerusalem? This kind of vividness. This is the second novel I've now read, Israeli novel, in which, there's annihilation of Israel as the great theme of the novel. The one I just read was Yishai Sarid's
Shlishi, yeah.
Which actually, it's not enough that it's destroyed once. First Israel is destroyed, and then a kingdom arises in its place, and then that's destroyed. So you kind of get two destructions for the price of one. But just how do we, on a kind of Kishka's level, relate to a retelling of Jeremiah that actually comes to pass in the present world?
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, I was joking with my kids today. I was, telling them, yeah, I want to, it's a common, Jewish practice not to get a haircut during this time because it's a time of mourning. So I said, I got to make sure to get my haircut, which of course I didn't do in the end. And I told them, I feel like for once in my life, like I can really get into this period of mourning, right? There's so much, off in the world that, there it is. I don't know if this is the place for this, but in terms of contemporary Israeli fiction, those are two of, I know a trilogy, but I think there are even more books that kind of imagine the destruction of a sort of new biblical Israel, because there's a tremendous amount of anxiety, and there has been since the establishment of the state, but heightened, with various events amongst Israeli writers. And it's you could call it a tic or a habit, but this is an exercise that's undertaken time and again in Israeli fiction and poetry to really think through, what it means, what it looks like, probably because it reflects not only criticism of, the government or of the society, but also this, sense of vulnerability, which is always there. So, yeah. Other comments or thoughts? Yes.
Hi, this is Lori Pierce from San Francisco. I have a question that about the author's reference to Zelda. I'm not familiar, I know of her name, I'm not familiar with her work. I got so far as looking up the leisure as the touch point in there, and I saw that it was written in 1967. So I was kind of wondering, given the English name and the date and so on, do you think that's a significant choice, or in what ways is it a significant choice of contemporary poets to refer to?
So, I mean, I wasn't able to entirely decode why specifically that worked. Maybe others would, but I would just say that, Zelda is one of the foundational, poets of modern Hebrew. She's not just another poet, but she's also conceived of, at least nowadays, I don't know what nowadays is in the novel, as somewhat old school. But more than that, it wasn't clear to me why, that poet and that writer was so important, that book was so important. Yeah. Miriam.
I would think that Zelda, to me, represented like old Zionism of good values. So the book, one thing we didn't really go into in depth is all the critique of contemporary Israel and Israeli life, which is, I thought that was another thing we didn't go into. I thought it was a little heavy-handed, but there's so much critique of, the Jeremiah against, Israeli life today, and the absence of values. And the Holy Land, which was a big scandal, the development of the Holy Land Hotel as a big scandal in Israel. So there's just, the absence of values, and Zelda represents the Israel that once was. So the Zion, the positive Zionism. So the values, the communitarian values, that whole ethos. So that's what I think. It's the good Israel.
I see Elisheva wrote Yisrael Hayafa is
Right.
Zelda, the beautiful,
Right.
Israel, not the one
exactly.
where corruption builds this architectural monstrosity that ends up taking down a prime minister and a mayor and
Right. So these corrupt politicians versus the vision of Zelda.
Yeah. That seems to make sense. Yeah, Rachel.
think that within contemporary Israeli conversation on poetry, Zelda also represents someone who was very, very much connected to the Jewish sources. She was religious. She was very, unlike a lot of the big poets who were very much anshe kibbutzim, et cetera, very atheistic, anti-religious often. She was extremely rooted in Jewish sources. Unlike Yehuda Amichai, it wasn't as an act of defiance. She wasn't using them to defy them. She really believed and she really cared. And she remarkably, through the poetic language she created, was able to use those sources to create a language for individual feelings and individual experience. So she kind of carved this middle path that's not nationalistic, accepting the us language, the we language, the we are continuing the past language, but at the same time not going to a very individualistic bent. And I think that perhaps this is something that Muck bemoans and mourns the impossibility of that the compulsion to relive the past, the compulsion to continue down the past, whether it's a positive or at least God-created compulsion in Yirmiyahu's case, or an ambition-driven compulsion in Tzidkiyahu's case, everybody's stuck in Muck in one way or another, and there's no room for that Zelda-like personification, like individuation within culture, within the past.
Yeah.
And then, of course, she wrote "L'chol ish yashem," like every man is. So, like that's why I think like her most famous poems. So, that idea of naming.
Yeah, Beth.
I was going to add to the idea of individualism in poetry. Another poet that he mentions is Yonah Wallach, who is known as this mystical poet, very, very much individualistic, sort of a poet of vision. So I think that's also just important to kind of throw into the text.
Yeah. Thanks. Great. Okay, I have to say that I thoroughly enjoyed this. I have a love-hate relationship with Zoom, and this was excellent. I mean, first of all, Ashira had sent me the list of participants, people had signed up. I said, oh my. I mean, it's like everyone is going to have, these amazing thoughts and things to say. And it was somewhat intimidating, to be honest. But on the other hand, I was really looking forward to this conversation. And even with that, it exceeded my expectations. It was so good to learn from all of you and to learn with you. Also to hear and see people that I've read in different forums. So I just wanted to really thank you for participating, and I really hope that that you're going to continue. We'd like to keep this going. For now, I think we'll still be doing it via Zoom, but when we can, probably in the New York area, we will also do things together, physically. I really learned so much from you, and it'd be wonderful if you could stay with us for this journey.
Yeah, I'll just echo that to everyone. Shai, thank you so much for inviting us to read texts in light of one another, for facilitating that, for bringing out the very details, and the strands that we would have maybe perhaps glossed over, and for everyone for contributing in just different ways from your unique standpoints. So I think I just want to thank you, everyone. If you are interested in, going to the back channels of 929 in the cycle, we completed Yirmiyahu a month or so ago. So all the content is there, including people on this forum who have written for us, Beth, Rachel, Joe, lots of people. So it's just great to see you all. And if you're not on the 929 weekly email listserv, I will follow up afterwards so that you can, receive that each Friday about events that are happening in addition. And we'll be in touch with our next book salon selection. And as we enter this period of 3 weeks, wishing everyone, not supposed to relish in comfort, but comfort in whatever way that the study of text and community can bring to you. And it's just great to see you. So yeah, be in touch via email with suggestions. Also, we would love to hear suggestions. We're opening it up to the community.